I was still holding the champagne flute when the courier asked for my signature. The ink on the acquisition contract hadn't dried, the room smelled like strawberries and printer toner and a future I had sweated a decade to reach. $65 million for an idea I nursed in windowless labs no one wanted me in. The envelope felt harmless. Then I slid out the papers and saw her name, my name, everything splitting down the spine of our life. At the exact moment I finally won, she staged the cleanest exit I'd ever seen. It took me a full breath to realize the betrayal started long before the doorbell rang. I grew up counting second chances on one hand. On my block, you learned early how to make a promise louder than your circumstances. My promise was a device, a patient little square of circuitry that could turn wasted heat into usable energy without the losses that had always haunted conventional designs. I made it ugly at first, prototype boards like metal scabs, wires like veins, and I made it in a university lab that liked my grades but not my skin. Professors praised the work in public and withheld access in private. Grant committees smiled and asked if I'd considered collaborating with a more experienced lead. The lead they meant was never me. I met Ava when I was repairing a borrowed oscilloscope. She laughed at my stubbornness with machines and touched my shoulder like she was grounding me. We were both building futures out of thin air, mine in conversion efficiency, hers in corporate law. I mistook her precision for faith. She mistook my resilience for endless supply. We married in a courthouse under fluorescent lights, promising to keep each other from the places we'd already escaped. What we didn't speak aloud were the ways the world had trained us to brace for impact, to file papers, just in case, to pre-calculate survival. The first time my patent filing was misplaced. The clerk apologized by calling me Buddy and not looking up. The second time, an updated review recommended denial on grounds that read like a checklist for who gets to invent. The data was sound, the prior art clean. Still, I kept getting told to wait. My advisor, white coat, white teeth, suggested I license my design to a consortium that would add credibility. When I declined, my lab access narrowed, then my funding, then my name was quietly left off a conference poster that showcased my own graphs. I worked nights in a shared space with flickering lights and a door that stuck in summer. Ava grew distant in increments, the way ice forms, surface first, then underneath. She asked about timelines, investors, exit multiples. She corrected my phrasing in emails to people who pronounced my last name like a speed bump. I told myself this was partnership. She handled the world. I handled the work. When a venture group finally believed what the university wouldn't, the term sheet came with smiles and a clause that valued my shares at a fraction until key de-risking milestones. It felt like a choke chain disguised as a necklace. I took it anyway because I'd learned the difference between a perfect door and one that opens. Years later, when a global manufacturer saw in my device the missing link for their energy division, negotiations moved fast. I wanted to breathe. I wanted Ava to see me as more than a long bet. The acquisition number shocked the room, $65 million for the patents, with an earnout if efficiency improved another 2%. I texted Ava a photo of the signed page and a heart. The reply didn't come. I decided she was busy. I decided to celebrate anyway, to forgive our exhaustion, to imagine our lives finally relaxing into the shape of our original vow. Then the doorbell rang. The courier's envelope was clinical. Divorce papers, filed 2 days before the acquisition closed, served 1 hour after the wire hit escrow. I found myself focusing not on the headlines of my life dissolving, but on margins, the way her legal firm's logo curled like a hook, the tidy bullet points that divided years into categories of asset and liability. Our house, our savings, my shares. She had listed my patent portfolio as marital property, developed within union, supported by emails, calendar invites, and photos of late-night meals left outside the lab door. Care looks like contribution on paper. On paper, contribution becomes claim. I walked the perimeter of our living room in loops, inventorying the objects her absence had activated. The granite countertop we argued over. The couch where we watched other people's dramas instead of naming our own. The framed photo from the day my prototype finally hit the efficiency target, and no one from the department showed up. In it, I was smiling with a mouth that hadn't learned its future. Beside the frame, a sticky note in Ava's tight handwriting. Call accountant vesting. The date on it was from months ago. Around the same time I noticed 2 extra visits to her office calendar, and the way she started saying, "Your company," instead of "our future." I told myself I could separate love from math. My lawyer, recommended by a friend who knew the gravity of my predicament, spoke softly, as if careful not to disturb fault lines. She said the timing was strategic, the claims aggressive but not unheard of. She asked if anything felt off during diligence. I almost laughed. What didn't? The background checks that insinuated my competence was provisional. The additional proof requests other inventors never saw. The sudden warmth from people who had doubted me, how their compliments came wrapped in ownership. And under it all, the steady rattle of being told by a world of rooms that I should be grateful for narrow doors. 2 nights later, I discovered the ledger that turned suspicion into geometry. A PDF on our shared drive, auto-synced from Ava's firm, open on my laptop like a confession that forgot to hide. Tables showed dates, sums, and subtly labeled accounts. Her retainers started months before our closeness ended. There were memos titled, "Risk Containment, Patent Proceeds," and "Anticipated PR Scenarios." In one, my picture, lifted from the company website, sat beside a line about lanes of narrative control. I stared at the word control until the letters unspooled. Someone had diagrammed my life as an opportunity zone. It would be easy to paint her as a villain, but betrayal rarely wears horns. It wears professionalism. It speaks fluent future. Ava had come from scarcity, too. She trusted structures because they reward compliance. She believed in fairness because she could file for it. Meanwhile, I carried fairness on my back like a piece of equipment, heavy, essential, unacknowledged. The more the deal became public, the more old ghosts texted. Former colleagues congratulated me with thin amazement. An investor who once called my grit inspiring asked if I planned to give back. The implication was that I'd been given something. When the acquisition hit the news, a columnist used the phrase, "unlikely inventor." I closed the tab. I opened another, Courtroom Schedules. The system that taught me patience was now a stopwatch, counting my life in appearances, affidavits, and the slow appointment of truth. The courtroom was colder than the labs where I learned to hold my breath. Ava sat across the aisle in a shell-colored blazer that made her look like a wave right before it breaks. There were no witnesses to the origin moments that started us, the small confessions made over instant noodles, the nights she read my draft claims and underlined verbs like lifelines. There were only exhibits. Exhibits always seem neutral. Their cruelty is in how they pretend to be. Her attorney spoke first, weaving a narrative of joint endeavor, of a spouse's invisible labor that undergirded my visible success. It wasn't wrong. It just wasn't complete. The story skipped over the ways my work had been discounted until it was expensive, the extra hoops that cost years of life because of how I look when I enter a room. The argument implied that once the world finally conceded value, everyone who had touched the edges of that value deserved a slice. Justice, repackaged as allocation. My counsel stood and did not raise her voice. She spoke of timestamps, prior filings, an invention notebook kept since before our marriage, third-party attestations of the prototype's early performance. She explained how the technology matured within me long before it matured in the world. She described what is hard to quantify, the mornings I left for the lab before sunrise to avoid questions, the reviews that demanded more proof, not because my data was weaker but because my story was. Then she did something that made the room shift. She placed side by side 2 patent office letters, one sent to me with extra requirements, one sent to a peer with a similar filing that sailed through. Same examiner, same month. Different standards, different skin. The judge frowned in the way someone does when presented with a pattern they didn't ask to see. For a second I saw it land, how race had worked like a silent tax on my time and opportunity, How the margin of error in my process was not physics but people. Ava looked down. I thought of the nights she held me after another bureaucratic erosion and told me to keep going, that the work would outlast the gatekeepers. I wondered whether she had believed her own words, or if they had been investments hedged against an outcome she could leverage. Numbers started moving. Settlement proposals were floated and dismissed. The threat of a protracted public fight pushed both sides toward a middle that felt like a cliff edge softened with moss. In the hallway, as teams caucused, I leaned against a window and stared at a strip of sky the color of old aluminum. I realized the climax wasn't the gavel, or the check, or even the papers. It was the choice of what story I would carry beyond that door, one where I was a prize contested by lawyers, or one where I reclaimed authorship of the narrative that had been graded, audited, and sold. The deal we reached was clinical, a one-time settlement less than her ask and more than my pride liked, an acknowledgement of non-monetary contributions with no claim to future earnouts, a mutual statement that tried to make complicated things sound simple. No winners, only a ledger that finally stopped taking from me what it had never given. After the courthouse, I went back to the lab. Not the corporate campus with glass walls and plaque futures, but the original space with the sticky door. Dust lay on the workbench like a thin apology. The posters on the walls had curled. The coffee machine stuttered a mechanical cough. I stood where I had once balanced on the edge between promise and failure and felt both sensations return, layered like weather. My company's new owners had arranged a celebratory dinner, my phone filled with invitations to panels, interviews, fireside conversations where I could perform inspiration on command. I turned most of them down. Money doesn't fix the old rooms, it just lets you leave them with the lights on. It also attracts a certain species of friendship, fluent in congratulations and silent on where they stood when doors were closed. I learned to say thank you without granting passage. I learned to ask for receipts from the institutions that now wanted my story to polish their brochures. If you once called my work aspirational, you didn't get to sell it as inevitable. As for Ava, we separated our lives with the same efficiency we once used to merge them. The settlement wired, the statements drafted, the public announcement written in a way that made strangers nod. She moved into a smaller place closer to the office. Friends told me she looked tired and composed, like someone who had chosen her outcome and was paying for it in installments. I stopped checking her public profiles. On sleepless nights, I tried to identify the exact moment we crossed from partnership into calculus. I never found a single point. Betrayal, like corrosion, favors edges. I worked on the earnout target in the quiet hours, chasing 2% as if it were absolution. The new team was kind, or at least practiced at kindness. They treated me like an origin worth respecting, not an acquisition to be digested. When they asked how to support, I said access. Give me the materials I used to fight for. Remove the assumptions at the door. Bring me colleagues who see critique as oxygen, not entertainment. They listened, or they were very good at pretending. Either way, the lab brightened. We shaved losses in corners no one had noticed. We coaxed the device toward that leaner curve where waste becomes work. Meanwhile, I started a fund, not the splashy kind with glossy decks, but a small, relentless engine aimed at people who reminded me of the version of myself that stood in offices and explained basic physics to men who pretended not to hear. We didn't call it diversity or pipeline. We called it a return to accuracy. Because the truth is simple, talent is distributed evenly, permission is not. We invested time before money. We taught how to build prototypes that persist after institutions shrug. We documented processes with the assumption that someone, somewhere, would try to rename them without you. When I spoke publicly, I didn't tell the divorce story for sympathy or spectacle. I told it because betrayal in my life was never only personal. It was systemic, braided into the forms and timelines that evaluated me differently while insisting the rules were neutral. The papers at my door were just the neatest expression of a pattern that began long before love and would persist beyond it unless named. In that naming, there's a small rebellion. You refuse to adopt the vocabulary of the people who benefited from your doubt. You insist on specificity. You showed the receipts. People asked if I forgave Ava. Forgiveness is a shape that changes under light. I don't wish her failure, and I do not mistake her choices for fate. We were both trained by scarcity. We learned different lessons. Mine is that security built on someone else's eventual win becomes hunger for their moment, not joy in it. I hope she unlearns that. I hope I have. On the day the earnout target finally tipped green, the sensors held steady, the readout smiled a plain number, and I let myself sit. No champagne. No big room. Just the hum of something working as designed. I thought about the invisible charges that had been attached to my life. The time tax, the suspicion tax, the credential tax that asks for extra degrees to prove a competence others presumed. When the device clicked, I kept the divorce papers in a drawer for a while, then scanned them and recycled the rest. I don't need objects to remember the lesson. Love is a verb until it becomes a vector, pointing away from you with measurable force. Systems are not neutral until they become transparent, and even then they carry the residue of who designed them. My work now is to build devices that harvest what the world wastes and turn it into power. The device is metal and math. The metaphor is obvious. Some nights, walking home, I pass a townhouse window and catch a couple laughing in profile. I wish them an unremarkable privacy. Then I look up, think about heat escaping roofs into the sky, energy fleeing as if it belongs to no one. We treat loss like weather and gain like architecture. But what if we flip that? What if we designed our institutions to bleed less and our winds to shelter more? I can't engineer forgiveness or fortify trust with equations, but I can make a promise louder than my circumstances. To keep the next kid from trading years for a door that should have opened, to insist that unlikely is an insult to data, to remind anyone listening that betrayal grows best in systems that reward plausible stories over measurable truth. So when the courier's knock echoes in your hallway at the exact moment you finally win, breathe. Recognize the pattern, then decide whether you will be a case study or a catalyst. The papers are a chapter, not the book. The book is the proof that even in a world calibrated to doubt you, a steady hand and a clear record can turn waste into work, grief into guidance, and a single invention into a more accurate future. Would you trade your peace for a victory that proves the system wrong, or would you demand a kind of victory that rewrites the system itself?